After Trump began imposing tariffs globally, surprisingly, Vietnam, which is often referred to as a miniature version of China, responded very swiftly. It immediately made a hasty concession. The Vietnamese high-level officials promised Trump that they would reduce the tariffs on goods imported from the United States to zero and were willing to fully open up to the United States, all in exchange for a tariff exemption. To be honest, after Trump's tariff extortion plan was introduced, I had thought that some countries would compromise and make concessions, but I didn't expect that Vietnam would be the first to jump out. I'm afraid even Trump didn't anticipate such a situation. So, what exactly is Vietnam afraid of? Why did it compromise with Trump so quickly, and how will Trump respond? Recently, within Vietnam, a large-scale administrative reform is underway. The high-level officials are streamlining provincial units and local institutions to improve administrative efficiency. With a more practical attitude, they aim to create an efficient and convenient business environment, hoping to seize more opportunities in the global economic transformation. The financial expenditure saved from streamlining institutions will be used to implement free education, which can cultivate more high-quality talents for economic construction. Vietnam has also set a goal of becoming a high-income country by 2045. Judging from its GDP growth rate of 7% in 2024, Vietnam needs to maintain this growth rate for the next 20 years, to have a chance of achieving this aspiration. However, this ambitious development plan formulated by the Vietnamese people is now at risk of being completely shattered by Trump's actions. On April 4, local time, Trump issued an executive order to fully implement reciprocal tariffs. The tariffs imposed on Vietnam reached 46%. If we add the previous uniform tariff of 10%, the cumulative tariff rate will reach 56%. For a country like Vietnam, this is nothing short of a bolt from the blue. Vietnam's industrial composition mainly consists of three categories. The first is the manufacturing industry, accounting for about 40%. The second is the tourism and service industry, accounting for about 45%. The third is the agriculture, forestry, and fishery industry, accounting for about 15%. It is not difficult to see that the manufacturing industry plays a very important role in Vietnam's economic structure. In fact, Vietnam's manufacturing industry mainly undertakes tasks with a relatively low technical level. To put it bluntly, Vietnam is a beneficiary of China's entrepot trade. It earns processing fees by acting as a technology assembly workshop for China and the United States. Therefore, China is Vietnam's largest source of imports, accounting for 37.8% of its total import volume. The United States is its largest export destination. The export volume in 2024 reached as high as $142 billion, accounting for 30% of the total export volume. These data show that Vietnam's economy is deeply bound to those of China and the United States. Any problems on either side will deal a heavy blow to it. Unfortunately, the United States has welcomed one of the most radical presidents, which also brings the greatest challenge to Vietnam. In 2024, Vietnam's trade surplus with the United States reached $123 billion, accounting for 12.3% of the total U.S. trade deficit. This makes Vietnam a key target of Trump's reciprocal tariff policy. According to Trump, all countries that have trade relations with the United States have imposed high tariffs on U.S. goods. So he wants to implement reciprocal tariffs to prevent others from taking advantage of the United States. In fact, although Vietnam only imported a little over $10 billion worth of goods from the United States, most of these goods basically have zero tariffs. So, why did Trump come down so hard on Vietnam? The key lies in Trump's method of calculating taxes. He uses the formula of having the proportion of the trade deficit, that is, Vietnam's trade surplus with the United States divided by Vietnam's export volume to the United States, and then multiplied by 50%. In 2024, Vietnam's proportion of the trade surplus reached 87%. After halving, the tax rate of 46% was calculated. More importantly, most of this huge trade surplus was created by foreign capital. Among them, they are mainly multinational enterprises from China, South Korea, and the United States. The goods they produce are exported to the United States, and Vietnam just earns a little hard-earned money in the middle. If the capital from other countries flees Vietnam due to Trump's high tariffs, The consequences will be a significant decline in the GDP growth rate, the unemployment of nearly 1 million people, as well as serious panic and social unrest. For Vietnam, this is definitely a disaster that it cannot afford. Any planned goals will become a pipe dream. Therefore, as soon as Trump's new policy was introduced, Vietnam quickly reacted. The high-level officials of Vietnam had a phone call with Trump. Their attitude was very sincere, and they were willing to negotiate on various conditions, as long as the United States lowered the high tariffs. To be honest, Vietnam's choice this time is not really a wrong one. It is essentially a small player caught between China and the United States, and it is impossible for it to confront the United States head-on. It simply doesn't have the ability to do so. Now the question is, whether Trump is willing to let them off the hook. In this round of the tariff war, several Southeast Asian countries have been imposed with high tariffs. Trump's aim is to block the gap in Vietnam's entrepot trade and crack down on the handicraft industries that have taken over from China in these countries. In other words, this is about employment rates. Although these industries are backward, they are exactly what the so-called MAGA needs. But in this way, Vietnam is the one that gets hurt the most. It is tantamount to smashing its own. If it doesn't do this business, the trade surplus will naturally disappear. That is to say, there will be no employment and economic growth either. Secondly, Trump hopes that Vietnam will buy more U.S. goods. However, the goods exported by the United States are either high-tech equipment, such as aircraft, semiconductor equipment, etc., or agricultural products. Vietnam doesn't have a great demand for these things. Moreover, Vietnam has its own agricultural products. What's more, U.S. goods are very expensive for Vietnam. After all, not every country can, like the United States, ask its people to pay more for goods. So Vietnam won't spend too much money on U.S. goods. All of the above are irreconcilable contradictions between the United States and Vietnam. It is worth mentioning that the current international order has been established, and the distribution of resources is already insufficient. Otherwise, the United States wouldn't impose tariffs globally. In other words, China's current development speed is already giving the United States a headache. So the United States definitely won't allow a second China to emerge. That is to say, even if Vietnam takes the initiative to show goodwill, Trump is unlikely to agree to Vietnam's request. However, this also poses a dilemma for Trump. If he agrees to Vietnam's request, then surely more countries will choose to compromise, and thus it will be impossible to achieve the so-called MAGA. If he doesn't agree, or if the United States and Vietnam ultimately cannot reach a tariff agreement acceptable to everyone, then it will be the ordinary Americans who will suffer next. The high tariffs will lead to a price increase of more than 30% for consumers. Can people accept that?